Mr. President, it's not often I come down to the floor to say I have a lot in common with the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Schumer from New York. In fact, in my 6 years in the Senate, I don't think I've ever done that. But after reading his remarks prior to the vote on the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, that we took yesterday, I thought I'd come down and make a few points on that nominee, that vote, and some issues that I have in common with the Majority Leader and now Secretary Walsh, and maybe some issues I don't have so much in common with the Majority Leader, but I think I do have with Secretary Walsh, which is why I voted for him. First, as I mentioned, Mr. President, I too supported our now Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, for some of the reasons that Senator Schumer did. Let me explain. Secretary Walsh started in the Laborers Union, Local 223 in Boston, age 21, following in his father's footsteps. Now, as many people know, the Laborers are the biggest building construction union in the country. They build things, pipelines, roads, oil wells, bridges. They have made America strong. I'm a big fan of the Laborers and leaders like Joey Merrick back home and Terry Sullivan, who I'm going to talk a little bit about. So Secretary Walsh followed his father's example, joined the Laborers in Boston. He's also the son of Irish immigrants, which is something that is near and dear to my heart. And now Senator Schumer said he had something very much in common yesterday when he spoke about Secretary Walsh with Secretary Walsh, because his grandfather was an immigrant from Eastern Europe who also, when he came over to America, got very involved with the labor movement. That's really a very common, powerful story of the American dream, common to millions. Senator Schumer's family, Secretary Walsh's family, and Mr. President, it's certainly a story that I have in common with those two. You see, my great-grandfather was from a family of Irish immigrants, and he was also very involved in the labor movement. In fact, he was one of the original co-founders of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the IBEW. He was its first Grand Marshal. I have something that I'm quite proud of here, a page from the history books of the IBEW talking about my great-grandfather's great work for the IBEW when it first got off the ground, and I'd like to submit this for the record.
Without objection.
So I look forward to working with Secretary Walsh on helping the men and women in America, certainly in my state, who build things. They succeeded. They rise up and help others rise up, other working men and women, the way Secretary Walsh's father did, the way Senator Schumer's grandfather did, the way my great-grandfather did. It's a great American story. But now, Mr. President, I must say that my views and Senator Schumer's diverge on some of the other things he may have been speaking about when he talked about Secretary Walsh's nomination yesterday. One, he was critical of some of the Trump administration's Department of Labor's policies as it related to the men and women who build things, the working men and women, despite, prior to the pandemic, with some of the policies that we implemented here, the United States having the strongest economy in decades, the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, wages finally going up after 2 decades of stagnation, and very importantly, for the working men and women of this country, a huge expansion and boom in the American energy sector. All of the above energy, oil, gas, renewables, important to the presiding officer as it is to Alaska. But let me describe one other narrative that I believe certainly is true, that I've seen in my professional life in Alaska, in America, but certainly back home in my state. And that's the narrative that I'm not so sure my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to highlight. But I'm going to highlight because I think it's really important, particularly now. And it's this. When national Democrats, whether during the Obama administration or now during the Biden administration, are set up with the choice where they have to choose between the interests of the working men and women in this country who build things versus the interests of the extremist, radical, environmental groups who want to kill jobs and shut them down, they almost always side with these groups who kill jobs, not the working men and women of America, not the working men and women of Alaska. This is true. My colleagues sometimes don't want to admit it, but it's true. And you know who else has seen it? And you know who else, I believe, knows it's true? Secretary Walsh, as a laborer. He's seen it. That's another reason why I voted for him. He and his fellow laborers, whether in Boston or Alaska, also know that this issue is true. Choice between the working men and women of America who build things versus the extremists who want to shut things down. Way too often, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle go with the extremists, not the men and women who build things in this country. Now, this narrative is not only continuing under the Biden administration, it is accelerating. And it's been bad for Alaska, bad for America, bad for working families. And to be honest, Mr. President, it's a bit surprising. President Biden came into office talking about his blue-collar roots. But right now, the record is anything but supporting the men and women who build things. A snapshot of what's going on in my state. First 4 weeks of the Biden administration, 8 executive orders focused on Alaska. 8. No other state said that many executive orders focused on Alaska working families. Day one, ANWR, trying to shut that down, that we got done in this body. Also killed the Keystone Pipeline. 10,000 jobs, laborers' jobs. Marty Walsh knows a lot about that. It goes on and on and on, Mr. President. Executive orders right now that, from my state's perspective, are focused on hurting working men and women. There's another one. I'll talk about a project we have, a big energy project in Alaska called the Willow Project. This has been permitted by Democrat and Republican administrations for 25 years to finally get it going. The Clinton administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, everybody. It's in the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska, a place set aside by Congress over 70 years ago for oil and gas development and good jobs. Not controversial at all. The Biden administration has put a hold on that. Here's the estimate, a $7 billion project. It will produce American energy, estimated 2,000 direct jobs on the Willow Project. This isn't some pie-in-the-sky project. We were starting it this winter. 2,000 direct jobs, 75% of which are union jobs. And they're saying, we're going to put a hold on that. Thousands of additional supporting jobs. They're going to put a hold on that. Why? Why? Well, we know why. Because in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, some of the most extreme radical environmental groups in the country sued to stop it. And they were successful. So guess what happened in Alaska this winter? During a recession, the 200 men and women who were working on this project were given pink slips and told to go home. That's what happened. That's what happened. So, Mr. President, don't just take my word for it. I want to quote again from Terry Sullivan. He is the head of the laborers, the biggest construction union in the country. And this was his reaction after day one of the Biden administration, a choice, working men and women who build things like pipelines, or the radical extremist environmental groups who want to shut down and kill American jobs. Choice, day one, the radical enviros win. Here's what the head of the laborers, and remember, Marty Walsh, Secretary Walsh, is a laborer from Boston. Here's what the head of the laborers, great American Terry O'Sullivan, said. Quote, the Biden administration's decision to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline permit on day one of his presidency is both insulting and disappointing to the thousands of hardworking LIUNA members, those are the laborers, who will lose good-paying, middle-class, family-supporting jobs. By blocking this 100% union project and pandering to environmental extremists, remember, this is Terry O'Sullivan talking, not Senator Sullivan talking, 1,000 union jobs will immediately vanish and 10,000 additional jobs will be foregone, unquote. That's Terry O'Sullivan. Remember, choice. Men and women who build things, who've made our country great, extremist groups like the Center for Biological Diversity, they go with the extremists. Here's Mark McManus, General President of the United Association of Union Plumbers and Pipe Fitters. They were going to build the Keystone Pipeline too, just like LIUNA members. Quote, in revoking this permit, the Biden administration has chosen to listen to the voices of fringe activists instead of union members in the American consumer on day one of the Biden administration. Let me be clear. This is Mark McManus still talking. When built with union labor by the men and women of the United Associations, pipelines like Keystone XL remain the safest, most efficient modes of energy transportation in the world. Sadly, the Biden administration has now put thousands of union members and workers out of work, unquote. So, Mr. President, this is why the Secretary of Labor that we just confirmed, and I was glad to support him because he's a laborer. He knows how to build things. He knows these politics. This is why it's important to have his voice, because the voice of the extremists is much stronger in this administration. And it's not just policies of killing union jobs, the men and women who build things for America, but if you listen, it's how the new members of this administration talk about these jobs. Listen. You got to listen. And what you hear is a condescending tone as it relates to these jobs. You may have heard John Kerry, Gina McCarthy, the climate change czars in the White House, who are saying in one of their press conferences, we need to, quote, help people make better choices on their jobs. Okay, that's pretty condescending. Pretty condescending. They're talking about laborers. They're talking about my oil and gas workers in the great state of Alaska or in Colorado. The Secretary of Energy in her confirmation hearing talked about how some jobs might have to be, quote, sacrificed. Even in the Environment and Public Works Committee, and I'm a very bipartisan guy, but some of my Senate colleagues on the other side of the aisle recently were talking about we need to encourage people to get more, quote, relevant jobs. Relevant jobs. Mr. President, what is more relevant than powering America? Until recently, the men and women who built America, pipelines, oil and gas rigs, roads, bridges, the men and women with dirt under their fingernails were celebrated as they should be. They built this country. They powered this country. They won wars for this country. By the way, they often fought in wars for this country. Then they came home, they got good jobs in the building trades, laborers, operating engineers, pipe fitters, teamsters, IBEWs. IBEW, like my great-grandfather helped start. Not so much anymore. The new Secretary of Energy is now calling them, quote, fossil workers who are from, quote, fossil communities. I'm not kidding. Listen to her. I've been trying to give them a little bit of advice. Don't use that term. It's condescending. You're talking to workers as if they're some kind of dinosaurs that should be put in a museum. Communities, fossil communities. Really? Madam Secretary, if you're listening, ditch that language. It drips with an attitude of being condescending towards these great Americans. Well, I was just home in my state with a bunch of these so-called fossil workers this past weekend. These are some of the best, most patriotic Americans anywhere. They're tough, they're hardworking, they love their country, but I will tell you, Mr. President, they're concerned. They are concerned. Why? Because they know exactly what I've been talking about here is happening. The radical extremist environmentalists, these groups who want to kill and are killing jobs. By the way, that lawsuit I talked about on the Willow Project, 200 Alaskans were sent home during a recession. Men and women who have to pay mortgages, pay tuition, sent home. So my workers in the great state of Alaska are concerned. They know that these groups have a beeline into the White House, that they are ascendant, and that they want to kill jobs, energy jobs, in my state and in America. And they're worried that the majority, now the Senate majority, has similar views. So they're nervous. But I'm hopeful on one thing. Given his background and his heritage, now I'm talking about the Secretary of Labor, Secretary Walsh, I believe that when the decisions are made, and I hope that when the decisions are being made in the Biden administration to kill more good-paying energy jobs that built this country, when those are coming before the Biden administration, that the new Secretary of Labor is going to stand up for the working men and women, stand up for the laborers in Boston, who he knows so well, or the laborers in Alaska, who he knows so well. And look at the other cabinet members and say, not on my watch. We're not going to kill any more of these jobs. That's what I'm hopeful for. That's what he committed to me to do. And that's why I voted for Secretary Walsh as the new Secretary of Labor.